All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, folks, wherever the heck in the world you are. It's the one and only V, the Guerrilla Economist, and we have the man of the hour himself, the one and only London Paul from the SiriusReport.com. Folks, if you haven't done so already, check out the Sirius Report. That's Sirius, Sirius as in the star. Okay, not serious as in, you're serious about something. But the seriousreport.com is a place where you find hard hitting and very, very serious information in regards to what is going on globally. Many people have commented and emailed over to me how much they love the Sirius Report and SiriusReport.com. Folks, for $4.75, for less than the price of a latte, a venti latte over at Starbucks, you're going to get a daily briefing every week, 5 days a week from London Paul himself. It is invaluable and one of the best, if not the best, geopolitical news brief you could sign up for. I mean, for the love of God, cancel your ridiculous $280 a year New York Times subscription. Please. Please. I mean, you don't need it. You don't need it. Maybe you have a special service to BuzzFeed. God help you if you do. Cancel it. Get on the SiriusReport.com and stay and keep abreast of what is really going on in the world. With that being said, folks, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Well, good morning, V, and to everyone else. And, well, thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah, we're doing well, thank you. And yourself?
I'm hanging in there, Paul. I'm trying to get into this whole, in the United States, we do this stupid, ridiculous thing. Not everywhere, but mostly in the country, where we move a clock forward 1 hour, then we move it back 1 hour. You put one foot in, you put one foot out, what
Shake it all
happens
about.
is, yeah, I'm all screwed up. It's Monday, and I'm up earlier than usual. It's just trying to get into the day, Paul.
Yeah, we do the same thing in 2 weeks. We do it the last sort of Sunday in March, so we've got that to look forward to. But yeah, I think we should start with talking about this nerve agent attack in the UK. Now, before we even get into that, it's interesting to note that, of course, already there's suggestions from various parties in the UK government, which is the Conservative Party, that that somehow the Russians are to blame, although there's certain people being a bit guarded. But before we even talk about it, we note that apparently the Conservative Party took donations of around £800,000 from Russian businessmen and their associates, and they're saying, well, we're not actually going to pay this back because we have very strict rules relating to donations, and these people are carefully vetted, and they only come from British citizens because these people are British citizens who are, Russian ethnicity, so they're perfectly fine. So there's no problem with that. But it kind of shows the kind of stupidity that you have a government who's taking donations and then criticizing Russia for their involvement in something which we'll get into now. If anyone's not aware, there was obviously this alleged, and I use the word alleged because I haven't seen any evidence to suggest what it was, but they said it was a nerve agent attack. Now, there's this person called Sergey Skripal, and he was an ex-Russian. Well, the Russians are saying he's not an agent, so it's a little bit difficult to ascertain what he was. But essentially, him and his daughter were found on this park bench looking pretty ill, and this police officer found him, and they subsequently, all three have ended up being put and now sort of in a hospital, critical but stable. Now, to put a bit of background to this, in 2006, Skripal was sentenced in Russia to 13 years in prison for cooperating with MI6 effectively and transferring names of Russian intelligence agents working undercover in Europe. And then in 2010, the then Russian President Medvedev signed this decree pardoning Skripal, and then with the latter then moving to the United Kingdom. Now, there's an allegation there was some spy swap made, so that provides a bit of background. So the obvious question is, from my perspective, is why was his daughter Yulia given a visa to go to the UK to visit her father, and then the Russians decide to attack both of them based on this allegation that it's Russia? It makes absolutely no sense. Why would they do that? If they wanted to in any way attack, launch any nerve agent attack or whatever on him and his daughter, why would they bother doing it and giving her a visa to go to the UK? It makes no sense. So the question is, why were both attacked as well? That in itself is a little bit suspicious. Now, some more background is they're saying that that initially they weren't sure, obviously, the origins of it, and they claim they've traced it back to a restaurant and a pub. So they've told these 500 Salisbury pub goers and diners to wash their possessions, and also, use baby wipes. That's the new way to combat nerve agents. Apparently, baby wipes. That's how you counter Russian nuclear technology. Everyone just gets baby wipes out, and that'll be the end of the problem.
That's it. I mean,
It's incredulous.
The crude and very stupid Russians, their chemical weapons are so weak that could be, it could be made inert by the use of baby wipes.
And then they're also claiming at this restaurant that, well, apparently it's not a problem for all these other goers, but just be careful because apparently
all the other goers had baby wipes on them.
Well, maybe they were wearing baby wipes. Who knows?
Because it was a Hillary Clinton day over there. That's why.
So apparently they had to table away from all the other diners. Well, that's a big coincidence. So the obvious question is, at this stage, and it's hard to understand exactly what's happened, but you would assume that whatever they were administered probably happened in this restaurant or in this pub. Now, the question is, why is there nobody else, apart from this police officer who found them out in the park, affected? No one else is affected by this, but they were seriously affected by it. So that's another question that thus far there's no answers to it. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Porton Down, which it's officially named the Defence Science and Technology Lab, and it's had this idea of being a controversial military facility, and it's now a centre for research into chemical and biological weapons. But there is a history to Porton Down that back in World War One, it was founded to counter German gas attacks. In the 50s, they developed, tear gas, CS gas, and also they developed the nerve agent VX. Now, its focus now officially is to improve defence and improve equipment and tests in order to protect troops and the population. But also in 1999, police probed allegations of testing that may have endangered the lives of soldiers without their knowledge. Well, we know historically that's gone on everywhere across the world. So let's not just point the finger at the UK. But and then I think it was about in 2008, the Ministry of Defence awarded 300 and odd former members of the armed forces about £3 million, or about 4.2 million US dollars. There were no criminal prosecutions, so that may have been tied to that. I don't think there's any evidence that Porton Down's doing, manufacturing nasty weapons, but I do think it's quite interesting that Porton Down is only 7 miles away from where this incident happened in Salisbury. Now, that might just be a gigantic coincidence, of course, but it is because, of course, now Porton Down have taken apparently the samples as evidence to ascertain what it is this nerve agent is. Now, of course, as ever, there is a total lack of evidence to say it was a Russian attack, because anyone can acquire or manufacture a nerve agent and seek to frame someone else. Syria is a great example. How many times has the Assad government been framed for launching chemical attacks based on weapons they never manufactured and never owned?
Yeah, it's like every other Tuesday.
Yeah, exactly. And where's the evidence in how it was administered? Because this always comes back to this point. Whenever these attacks happen, the thing that always concerns me is, why is it the person administering it never turns up critically ill? You never seem to have the person who administered it ever turns up ill in any way, shape, or form. I mean, what was it? Did they enter the restaurant wearing a protective suit and then stuck it in someone's drink or food? I mean, it's incredulous that these questions are never answered, because the risk to the person administering it is huge. In all these situations, that's why typically when they launch chemical weapons attacks, they launch them as in bombs, and then so therefore they're miles away from the scene of where it happened. Now, the question is, it probably isn't airborne. It is probably more likely to be ingested or in liquid form. Well, then the question is, how did so many hours later a police officer managed to be exposed to it. Now, that doesn't mean there's anything necessarily suspicious about that, but why was he exposed to it? Okay, probably in close contact to the two people concerned, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of anyone else having any symptoms. And they've now got something like 250 counter-terrorism people involved in it. They claim they've had 200 witnesses already. I mean, it sounds utterly unbelievable. And then the motivation is, why would Russia do this? I mean, if they had issues with Skripal, they would never have given him immunity and deported him and left it 8 years to decide to do something.
Exactly.
Why was his daughter also affected? The other thing is, here's the two big reasons why there's motives to discredit Russia. You've got the Russian elections coming up with Putin in a very short space of time. You've got the World Cup in Russia coming up in June. Apparently there's already talk of certain delegations refusing from the UK to go to Russia with, before any evidence has even been presented. And also in the process, there's even talk of England like maybe just deciding to scratch from the World Cup and not go in protest. But this is all just to convey this idea it's Russia. There is zero evidence to support it was Russia. I mean, just because a nerve agent may want to be manufactured in Russia doesn't mean it's Russia. I mean, it's a bit like this idea, well, we have the IP address of the Russians who are hacking things, when anyone can spoof their IP address to appear from anywhere. It's just farcical. And as Putin came out and said, I think the UK should first sort out Skripal's case before talking to Moscow. It is farcical. And if the UK decides to try and in any way, shape or form launch sanctions against the Russians, it'll be a hugely retrograde step. There was even talk that there was rumours, well, we might consider military action against Russia. I don't presume that doesn't mean launching weapons, but what are they going to do? Just deploy, more troops on the Russian border? I mean, it's ridiculous.
They're going to do one better, Paul, unbeknownst to you and to many of the listeners here on this show. The European Union, along with the UK, have been creating and training an elite band, a battalion actually, of transgendered troops that are specifically trained to storm the Russian front. I mean, it might as well be that ridiculous to even. I mean, who are these crazy people spewing these things? I mean, madness has to stop at some point.
Well, yeah, and it does, and the point is, there is, here's the question. First off, who was responsible for this attack, and therefore if they know who it is, why is the person not being arrested? And if they don't, how can they at all attribute it to Russia? Oh, just because the person happened to be an ex-Russian spy. And I come back to the point: why was his daughter given a visa to come and visit him? If the Russians would not go, well, actually, let's look at the counter argument and say it was the Russians, although there's no evidence to support it. So if the Russians wanted to try and kill both of them, why would they wait till she came to the UK to do it? There's absolutely illogical to do that, and makes absolutely zero sense. I mean, if they wanted to do away with it, then they'd do it in their own country where no one would be aware of it. So that's the first thing.
So sloppy. That's how you know it's not the Russians. It's so sloppy.
Yeah, and the point is, the Russians were obviously quite happy for her to go and visit him. They obviously don't see him as a threat or a problem anymore. And as I say, why did they wait 8 years to do this just before the presidential elections in Russia? I mean, if the Russians wanted to do it, they wouldn't do it now. They'd do it in 2 weeks after the presidential election. And not that I'm suggesting for 1 minute they did, because I don't believe there's in any way, shape or form Russia's responsible. But the timing is because it's deliberately trying to discredit Putin prior to the election. So, I mean, there's probably a lot of conspiracy theories that'll go around about what was really going on. I mean, I don't think Skripal was at all an agent for the UK anymore in any way, shape or form. So I think you can completely rule that out. I think the guy was just living his life in the UK in a very quiet place. Salisbury's quite a nice part of the world down there. But I think it's just desperation that they actually think the Russian people are going to listen to this and go, well, actually, I think we'll just have to vote Putin out because of this alleged nerve agent attack in the UK. But the way the media is handling it and describing it, there's no context as ever. There's no discussion as to why would the Russians do it and what about the timing that you do. Of course, you hear none of that, but I think it's just a sign of desperation that they will try to do anything to discredit and undermine Putin prior to an election, and it's part of this anti-Russian bandwagon. In the process, two perfectly innocent people living their lives. Now, okay, you might say Skripal had this controversy about his past, but that's in the past. The guy's just lived, probably retired, and his daughter comes to visit him, and they're both extremely ill. Now, the question is, they're stable but critical now. What happens if they pull through with this and they're able to give their account of things that happen?
They better not.
that may raise some very, very serious questions. Because the chances are they may not be aware of how it's being put into if it's being ingested through liquid or food. But the question is, if it is, then were they interviewing people in the restaurant to ascertain if they're aware of anything happening? And if they were sat on their own, away from everybody else as is being portrayed, then if it was put in the food, then someone inside the restaurant must have had some responsibility or in some way, shape or form, if that's the case. Because otherwise, there's a lot of assumptions there, because we don't know whether the source of it was the restaurant or the pub, but that's a reasonable line of questioning. It's not saying anyone's responsible, but it's a reasonable line of questioning. We've not heard that. Why aren't they interviewing these people? So the whole thing's an utter farce. And the worst part is that they're probably also using the pub and the restaurant as a smokescreen to hide the reality of what's happened, which is going to cause a huge amount of distress to the people who own these restaurants and pubs, and also all the people who are in there. I mean, it's hundreds of these people in a pub and dining at that on that day. So you're going to put them through an enormous amount of stress. But of course, there's the greater good to try and discredit the Russians. So who cares what collateral damage you have in the process?
Exactly correct. With these crazy lunatics, it's all about the end justifies the means, and it doesn't matter who or what you inconvenience, hurt, or malign along the way. This obsession that the West has with Russia needs to end very, very quickly, because it's ridiculous, Paul. Especially with last week's State of the Union that Putin did. It's vital this nonsense stops. It's ridiculous at this point.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned about the State of Union, because what do we see? A matter of days later, US senators demanding Tillerson starts a new round of talks with Russia, like yesterday, in the wake of his announcements and regarding nuclear weapons. And two of the people amongst, I don't know how many it was, Bernie Sanders and Dianne Feinstein, were people who signed a letter demanding Tillerson does this. Now, what's interesting is the whole kind of US-Russia strategic dialogue kind of collapsed, and it just wasn't happening. Of course, Putin makes his address on the 1st of March, and he refers to these weapons. And suddenly, there's people in the Senate going, hang on, they're not limited by this new START treaty. This is really dangerous. This is really serious. We're going to have to start having negotiations with the Russians. That shows the extent of the realization that Putin this isn't a joke. This isn't bravado. He's telling the Western nations, as we discussed last week, this is serious. I mean, you mentioned the interview with Megyn Kelly, and I watched a little bit of it. I kind of scout through it, put the subtitles on, and found some bits that were interesting. And one bit, she raised the question, was like, well, is this reality? And well, yes, of course it is. I'm not going to tell you something that isn't true, and that's the difference. Russia wouldn't put that kind of bravado out there if that's all it was. It is actually a solid reality, and this is why the US Senate now are panicking, going, hang on, this does raise a credible threat. So as far as they're concerned, it's not an issue while the US was in the ascendancy. Now they've realized the US is a sitting duck. All of a sudden, everyone's panicking about it.
It really is, man. Let me ask you a question about this, Paul. Your take on the latest round of taxing and tariffs from the administration with China, and now we're hearing news that the American steel manufacturers are ramping up. And can you just break this down for us?
Well, we kind of touched on it. I mean, in principle, it's a very myopic move, as we said, because you've now got nations, obviously they signed the order that you're going to have 25% tariffs on steel imports and 10% on aluminium exports, and that's supposed to go into effect in 15 days, so it's obviously less than that now. But already Washington's opening up ways to have exemptions because there's a lot of pressure coming from allies and inverted commas. I mean, one example is between the US and Europe. So you've got Merkel, who's now saying, well, actually, we're hopeful for discussions and dialogue on this matter, but we've got to be ready to respond to these actions and impose our own trade tariffs if talks fail. Well, yes, that's very, very likely, and the European Trade Commission's already said they're considering this now. But by all accounts, I think Wilbur Ross is supposed to be talking to the Europeans about the tariffs they've imposed, or they would, seek to impose on the US. Now, we've already seen how Australia is kind of getting around this issue of the trade sanctions. In many ways, I think Trump is playing a game of bravado where he's threatening sanctions and then looking to get concessions from nations such as, in terms of NATO nations, for example, they may pay more premiums towards the costs for running NATO, or they might be able to have some sort of horse trading and resolve issues in the process. So, but it's a big gamble because it could very likely blow up in the US's face. However, there is a flip side to this, which we talked about it last Monday. I kind of went away and thought, okay, well, let's throw this on its head and try and see a different way around, because never assume Trump does things for obvious reasons. And the flip side can be that this could be very deeply damaging to cabal industries across the planet. So there might be some method in that, well, we can cause major problems to cabal industries across the globe in terms of putting tariffs. Now that is a possibility. Now, in terms of China, there's obviously quite an interesting development where the US is almost politely now saying to China, well, we'd really like you to reduce the trade deficit. I think there was talk of about $100 billion all told. But the interesting part is it's like about $1 billion a year. So let's be honest, it's not, from the Chinese perspective, it's nothing. And from the US perspective, it's tokenism. But what's always overlooked in these ideas, and still the media is coming out like the US can play hardball. China, as we've said countless times before, is the US's largest creditor. But let's look forward to what is the likely scenario when the Federal Reserve note is replaced by a Treasury US dollar that's going to be significantly devalued. Why? Because the US has next to no gold. That's. I mean, I did something with it in the podcast.
You're very wrong,
which
Paul.
was
We have deep storage gold. No one's seen it. No one's touched it. No one's even heard about it. But it's somewhere there, and we just have to find it. That's all. It's just deep storage gold.
It's so deep it hasn't even been dug out the ground.
That's how deep it is.
But so we talked about that in a lot of detail in the podcast. Why there's a whole bunch of reasons, which we won't go into now, for why it's just economically insane that the US is attacking the price of gold, or attacking gold with paper dollars in the process. But if we fast forward, as we said, and we project that the dollar is going to be significantly devalued, right? This therefore means that the trade deficit can be reduced. Why? Because suddenly the US becomes a perfect export market to China as it continues to rotate its economy from being export to more consumption based. Although ironically, I think China's recently announced that its exports have never been higher. So it's actually intelligently been able to rotate its economy to be more consumption based. In the process, it's exporting more and more products. That's because they have an intelligent government, and we can come on to the whole Xi thing in a minute and suspending term, which we'll talk about shortly. So what this means is, in the process, China intelligently, from their perspective, gets to have a significant slice of the export market to China via investments in the US. So it's a win-win for that. They put a lot of investments into the US and build up the infrastructure. they can win on the side of the companies that are exporting the products to China for their consumption-based market. So it's a win-win. In the process, it will reduce the trade deficit and will help to reindustrialize the US. So maybe the China or the US asking China for a plan to reduce the trade deficit is a very polite way of looking to the future as to how things are going to unfold. But inevitably, there is going to be a lot of concern across the world as to what these tariffs can do. And in principle, it could be very damaging, certainly to the US internal market, as we've said. I think it's a gamble. I think it may be giving us an indication that we're nearer to these big changes than perhaps people realize. And when I say near, I don't mean it's going to happen next week or next month. Things like this don't happen in the matter of days, weeks, and months. It's these long-term projections will take however long they're going to take, and it's back to this point. We keep hearing dates. There are no dates. There never has been any dates. There never will be any date. Everything's in an event-driven order, and when certain things happen, other things will happen. And people need to stop buying into all these people coming out with dates. Okay, eventually someone's going to get it right. But for the last 5 years or more, all I've heard is endless dates given. This is going to happen next week. This will happen next month. This is going to happen next year and tomorrow, yesterday. And when has any of these dates ever come to fruition? Never. So if you want to keep believing in date and believing in people, coming out with the dates, fine, but don't be disappointed when dates come and go and things don't happen. But I do think in part, I think it's a gamble to try and take on the cabal's international industries and in a way raise them to the ground. Now there is a distinct possibility that might work, but it's a calculated gamble. But I suppose at the end of the day, from Trump's perspective, and it comes back to the point, he was brought in to take a wrecking ball to the cabal. If you take a wrecking ball to the cabal, you're going to have to break a lot of eggs to make an omelette, and maybe the trade tariff just has to break more eggs to cook the omelette. So that's I think from my perspective where we're at. Remains to be seen whether in real terms nations do have these agreements. It sort of reorders and recalibrates the role that the US has with these nations, and in the process do these other nations actually impose tariffs. So it could just be a gigantic headline making exercise, but when you drill it down, the reality is it won't affect nations the way in principle it will do. But I understand why there is concern, because in reality trade wars never benefit anyone. But then we're in a world that's rotating away from the cabal deep state, so all bets are off and many things will happen which will surprise people and may on face value be myopic. And I do think I'm concerned it is a bit myopic doing it, but maybe it's a calculated gamble that might just help the US and other nations in the process. But it is a big risk, and we'll see what unfolds in the coming weeks and months as whether this becomes a reality or is just for some other purpose, as we've just discussed.
Well, recently we've had not only Vladimir Putin's State of the Union, but we also have in China, Western media sources are hyperventilating, panicking because, only they are the virtuous ones. Only they are the ones who are virtuous and are all about democracy, and they care for their populations and their people, and they care so deeply about their citizenry, Paul. And they are already calling Xi a dictator, and that he's a maniacal, evil madman who's going to take over China perpetually and be their ruler. A new emperor is arising, they say. Can you temper that and put that into perspective, what it all means?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, the media will infer this. Well, the reality is that's not why China's doing what it's doing. Look, we've said this before, but maybe not everyone who listens has heard this or understands this to be the case. To become the premier in China, you have to really be capable of running the country and demonstrate it. I mean, Xi worked from the bottom. And before he became president, he had to prove his worth by he ran a region of 300 million people with a GDP of trillions of dollars, and it worked successful. And they went, "You've earned the right to become president now." with all due respect, how often does that happen in Western nations? Well, never,
Never
essentially.
ever. And another
Never.
thing is this: he is somebody who is a scientist himself. He is a very smart academician, unlike the lawyers and sycophants that make up our political class. Go ahead, Paul.
Absolutely. The other thing is, and which is worth noting, is that Xi's wife, very, very smart, intelligent person, incredibly intelligent, incredibly observant, and very much is unknown to the West of the role she plays
But let me
in
ask you a
terms of.
question. Does she have 79 personal assistants like Michelle Obama? And does she have any male appendages like Michelle Obama? Go ahead, Paul.
Was certainly nothing of the sort. I mean, that's the difference. Chinese governance doesn't work the way it does in the West, and the simple fact is that he has been instrumental in a very. I mean, he has done so much in a very short period, in a matter of 5 years, where he transformed the Chinese economy. They are now talking by 2020 of having zero poverty. They've taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into middle class. This is the reason the West can't understand things or doesn't want to understand it. It thinks that a one-party state is a dictatorship. Well, they first of all fail to tell people that you live in a one-party state effectively, because it doesn't matter who you vote for in the West. The other point is, if Xi wasn't doing his job, he would be booted out in a heartbeat. And the reason they will extend or are seeking to extend beyond the 10-year limit is because they believe and understand that he's the person to take China through beyond that 10-year limit. And that's why they've extended. He's not going to be president when he's 95 years of age and being like a dictating emperor. This is nonsense. That is the reality of why they want to extend it. But the point is, if he suddenly started to fail to deliver, he'd be out. He'd be
Gone.
removed.
Right.
Because the one thing people don't understand with China is the Chinese government knows that if it fails to deliver, the people will not tolerate it. And there's over 1 billion Chinese people, and I'm sorry that no government can survive if the Chinese population refused to cooperate. And people say they simply wouldn't do that. Well, they don't understand. That is the one thing the Chinese Communist Party, in inverted commas, for want of a better word, is fully appreciative of and is fully aware of the fact that the Chinese people simply will not tolerate it. So therefore, if they don't follow through with reforms and don't do all the things they've promised to do, they won't survive. So no, it's just typical Western ignorance. I've said this for many, many years. If you look at China through the eyes of the West, you are totally myopic
You'll never
to how
understand it.
China operates,
Right.
what China intends doing, and how the country and the people live
Yeah.
and think.
And Paul, the other thing is that people forget that the president of Premier, the president of China, that is a performance-based office. In other words, you can't have a lame duck, you know, president of China. It just doesn't work. He'll be thrown out. He'll be fired from his positions because he cannot deliver the metrics. And this was another thing that people don't understand, Paul, is that in China, there has to be a laid out plan for government. There has to be goals and metrics that need to be achieved. If these goals and metrics are not to be achieved, you're fired. You're gone. You're done. It's all over a red
Absolutely,
roses.
yeah. I mean, that's why they have 5-year plans. They have 10-year, 20-year, 50-year, and 100-year plan. China, in a very broad sense, knows what it's doing for decades to come. And the good thing with China is the one thing they don't do, which Western nations do, is they go, right, we need to do something, and they always go, we have to do it yesterday, and then they never succeed because they throw resources in the kitchen sink at it, and it's all a gigantic rush and it fails. China works very methodically, but if it says, right, we need to do this in 5 years, it will be done in 5 years. If it's a small task in relative terms, it'll be done in 6 months. It gets done in 6 months. They, as you say, and it is, if they don't fulfill those aims, people within the governmental structure will be fired. And here's the other thing. People talk about corruption. China knows it's had corruption. What's it done? It's fired millions of ministers and millions of people in positions of authority who were, for want of a better word, cooking the books, fiddling the system, corruption, stealing. Now, Imagine if that actually happened in the West, where the people who are responsible for destroying our
Truckers
nation.
would be praised all over here. We give them offices and lavish salaries and tell them to go ahead, Junior, go ahead and run the country to the ground. Here you go, and here's your golden parachute and a $10 million pension retirement waiting for you.
I mean, okay, at some point in the future, this is going to change, and that's going to be a huge culture shock for people in the West to realize that, in fact, their nations were far more corrupt than the nations they're force-fed to believe have corruption. And yeah, it exists in all countries, but nations like China and Russia are seeking to remedy those problems. But they realize the job's not done. Where in the West, people, if you try to talk about it, you're a conspiracy theorist if you dare to suggest it even exists. But anyway, that's by the by. But for sure, it's utter nonsense. Xi will not. I mean, probably realistically, he may serve 15 years or 14 years, maybe do 3 terms. And by that, and the other thing is with China is they will automatically now be starting to go, okay, well, have we got anyone who can be a legitimate successor to him in the future, who's going to carry on the legacy? And if they don't think there is, what are you going to do? Go, well, actually, let's just get rid of this guy after his 2 term, and just put someone in who's going to then not be capable of running China effectively as a true president. Otherwise, rather than all the fake prime ministers and presidents we have in Europe, I'd say Trump is not a fake president by any stretch now. But I mean, obviously, the US has been plagued by fake presidents as all the other nations have, and that is the big difference. So. Yeah, I think he probably might do 3 terms and then he'll call it a day, because by then they will have found a natural successor to carry on this legacy of the One Belt, One Road and the big, huge paradigm shift that is now underway and is irrefutable. And that's the reason why. So, yeah, of course, it's just nonsense coming out of Western media who like to, as I always say to people, go to China and go and see what it's like for yourself. And then they come back and we'll have a discussion about it.
It's amazing to me when I look at this whole entire thing. I look at the West. There is such a dearth of statesmen. I mean, there are politicians galore, but there is such a dearth of statesmen. And when I look at Xi and I look at Putin, I can say honestly, unequivocally, these are statesmen. These are people. These are men who love their country, who love their people, and do what's best for their people. And they take their jobs deadly serious. Deadly serious. How come? Why is it that
Of course.
the West we're like this? It's beyond me, Paul. How did we get here?
Well, I think it's a good point. We'll talk in a little bit about North Korea, because there's big, huge seismic changes. Now, what do we immediately see? The Western media is now trying to give the US credit as though they're the ones responsible for Kim Jong Un's backing down, and well, they say backing down, but of course that's not the reality. Well, the reality is that China and Russia were instrumental in having a lot of back channel discussions with Kim Jong Un and saying, look,
QAnon and those guys.
Well, to be honest, I don't know what they. I mean, I'll be straight. I've never read a single thing QAnon or Q or any of these people ever said is. I mean, each to their own, but it's of no interest to me. It might well have factual content. It might be all factual. It might be all not factual. I don't really. It's of no interest to me to deal with that sort of thing. It doesn't mean it's wrong. I just personally don't have time to bother dissecting what's said in it. But I look at the reality of things, and what do we see coming out of the back end of this recent contact between Seoul and Pyongyang? The South Korean National Security Advisor, where's he off to tomorrow? Russia. That says it all. But apparently, we're not sure yet who he's going to meet in Russia, but they're going to have discussions on the back of this. That tells you who the major players are, and that comes on the backdrop that relations between Russia and South Korea are on the up and up there. Recent President Moon Jae-in wants economic cooperation between Seoul and Moscow in countless areas. He's proposing building this Northeast Asia super grid to improve regional energy collaboration, and that's and multilateral economic and security protocol, and that's with Russia and China. That tells you who really is the main players. Now, what did Kim Jong-un do? And we said this, that Putin said Kim Jong-un's a very intelligent person. And despite all the Western media rhetoric to the contrary, yes, he is, because what did he do? He did precisely what the Iranians did. The Iranians played the faux nuclear card, which got the JCPOA agreement voted in, which lifted sanctions and enabled Iran to grow and develop as it is today. And what did Kim Jong-un do? He played the faux nuclear card. Why? Because it put the US on the back foot, because whenever a nation has nuclear capability, the US backs off. It's why, and this is the irony, it's why he went into Iraq and said that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. If he really had them, they'd never have gone in to Iraq. That's the reality.
Exactly.
So what's Kim Jong-un said? He's willing to sign a peace agreement with the US and establish diplomatic relations. He wants to normalize relations with Washington. And also he's talked about, well, we'd like the US to open an embassy in Pyongyang. Now, these are all serious considerations. And what does this do? This is great for the average US citizen. It's great for the United States, but it is very, very serious bad news for the Kabbalists. Because what do they want to do? They wanted to portray North Korea as the bogeyman. That's the reason why the US has to have military bases in South Korea. That's why we have to have the THAAD missile launches. That's why we're there, and we have a legitimate reason. Once Kim Jong-un plays the card of strength, it's not weakness, and says, I'll do exactly what you want to do. Right? Because if you're prepared to sign these agreements, the world sees it. I'm prepared to denuclearize. I'm prepared to stop ballistic missile and nuclear tests. We're in the position of strength. It's not a position of weakness, because he's taking the situation in hand and saying, I will do precisely what is going to ultimately be in the best interest of my nation. And why? Because there's main reasons. One, ultimately it will lead to the North and South Korea reunifying. Now, I first spoke about that a long time ago, and people said that will never happen. Well, it was always going to happen. We just had to get to the point where North Korea could play the cards in a certain way with the cooperation and assistance of China and Russia to make it happen, to destroy the Kabbalist dream of what they wanted to do. And we come back to the point, if the US is doing it from a position of strength, and when I say the US, I don't mean the Trump administration, I don't mean the US people, I'm talking about the Kabbalists, the deep state who run the US. They failed in their attempts to launch a preemptive strike. They failed to remove Kim Jong-un. And back probably nearly a year ago, watching, we've said this before, the world was teetering on the edge of a major conflict brewing in North Korea. It was stopped. And it was stopped because of Chinese and Russian intervention. The Kabbalists were determined, and it was a reality. It wasn't, no one ever talked about it. That was a reality. And there was a few days, sort of April time, I think it was, where the world really was teetering on the edge, and it all diffused. So when I hear all these people saying, well, a war's going to happen with in North Korea. Oh, it's still going to be a war. No, it's December. No, it's November. No, it's October. Oh, no, actually, it's January. No, it's March. It's May now. No, that was never. It's not going to happen. If it was going to happen, it would have happened a year ago, and it was stopped. And the end goal is unification. What does this do? It puts an end to the idea that North Korea is the bogeyman. It puts an end to US Kabbalist influence in the North and the South. You won't need any more US bases. THAAD will be removed, and the US will have no place left in the region. And in a normal world where the US functions as a strong nation amongst equals, the US will go, we don't want to be in this region. It's a huge expense to us. What is the point? We don't need it. There's no bogeyman. The North and South will reunify. We don't need to be there. It's thousands of miles from the US. We can move out, no problem. But the people who are really steam coming out their ears is the Kabbalists, because another one of their aims, which was to start a war in that region, are over. And Kim Jong-un is, for all the criticism he gets, is an intelligent person. He is not an idiot. The West likes to portray him as that. Fine, let the West portray him as that. And the other thing is, despite all the sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea's economy is actually growing. But there's not many people in the West who are even aware of that. But that is reality. Again, it proves the idea the Kabbalists think they can impose sanctions on people and it's going to destroy nations. Those days have gone. Yeah, it used to work and it caused mayhem and ended up often dethroning leaders and causing regime change. Those days are over. They failed in Russia and they've failed in North Korea, and it's failing everywhere else they're trying it. Even to a large extent, it's failed in Venezuela. Why? Because despite Maduro and all the problems associated with him, Russia and China are doing their damnedest to stop the nation collapsing. Why? Because they know full well, whilst as much as we could criticize Maduro for a whole bunch of reasons, legitimately, what's the alternative if you get a cabal tool and puppet installed in Venezuela? The outcome is going to be far more detrimental to Venezuela in the long term. So it doesn't mean Maduro's got a long-term future, but for now, they're fully aware, and that's why Rosneft particularly has done a huge amount to backstop the the Venezuelan oil sector and oil industry, and remove all the corruption and insanity, which mean that any nation that's energy producing to that extent should never be in that position. So that's a whole separate matter, but sanctions don't work anymore, and this is a big, huge win for North Korea, and a big, huge slap in the face, or probably stronger than a slap in the face for the Kabbalists. And it's all come about simply because there was a realization in the Trump administration that when Russia and China said, you launch a preemptive strike and we'll sink your entire fleet in the South China Sea, and maybe worse, and we're serious about it, the Trump administration took it seriously. I wonder whether Hillary Clinton, if she'd been elected, would have taken that seriously.
She's such a stupid idiot. She wouldn't have. She would have put the entire Pacific Fleet there, and the whole naval ship, the aircraft carrier being the obsolete weapon of war that it is, it would all sat in the bottom.
Well, the reason why I said all this months ago that, well, now people realize because the Russians have got technology which we said existed, but and people said, no, it doesn't. You're just saying that. Well, now the reality is the world knows that the Russians have this technology, and it's precisely why, the US, even the Kabbalists, backed off from launching a preemptive strike in North Korea, knowing full well what the outcome was. Putin's speech was just an affirmation of the reality that Western nations have known for many years, and it's another reason why they've had this desperation to portray the Russians as being this rogue state, effectively, and why they've done their damnedest to drag Russia into wars and economically destroy them, because they were desperate to get rid of Putin and to try and get some Western puppet or Western sympathetic leader in. And of course it failed, as we know, and unfortunately for humanity it has failed, because if it hadn't, consequences would have been catastrophic.
Absolutely. Paul, what say you? Last question would be the surging oil prices, and what do you think is going on with that? And is this the end of the petrodollar?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too concerned. I mean, surging oil prices may be good for US shale oil, but we can talk about US shale oil in a little bit of detail shortly. But it's also hugely beneficial to Iran and Russia and certain OPEC nations, but particularly Russia. Well, Russia's not obviously OPEC, but Russia as a nation and Iran. I mean, they can produce oil at $6 and $7 a barrel. So if you're selling oil at $60 a barrel, they're extremely happy. I'm not too concerned about the oil price. What will be interesting, you make the point that 2 weeks today, the Chinese are scheduled to launch the petro-yuan, which won't have an instant effect, but it will have a gradual effect. It will change the whole shape and see the death of the petrodollar. But one thing I covered off with in podcast on Friday was talking about the reality of the US energy sector. And we talked in some detail about the fact that the US has no energy dominance. Now, I'm not going to go into masses of detail because, A, it's not fair to subscribers, but B, it's also, we don't have all the time in the world to discuss it. But the reality is, to put it one point in context, everyone talks about US exporting 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. What they don't realize is the US imports 7.5 million per day. So there's a net deficit of 6 million. This isn't a nation that has energy dominance. The other thing is they talk about the shale oil sector. 4 out of the 5 major shale oil deposits is already in decline. So the shale oil industry is in sharp decline. Never mind the fact that economic reality will hit home and destroy the shale oil sector, which is propped up by obviously junk bonds. So there's no reality to this US oil dominance. And even if they think they can stop Nord Stream 2, which they won't, and do everything else to try and curb the Russian exports to Europe and try to stoke up their own exports to Western nations, it's simply not going to happen. At some point, the oil price is going to fall sharply. I think that's an inevitability. I mean, it happened a couple of years ago and it reached $25 a barrel. I'm still suspect we will reach that again, and it may go even lower when economic reality starts to hit home. But at the moment, there's no benefit for the capitalists to have, from their perspective, to have high oil prices, because it's benefiting the very nations they don't want to see it benefit. So Iran, Russia, to name but two. And of course, we come back to the point: who's a big dominant player in is the Chinese, because they've got a massive import market. So Chinese will not only will have the import market under their influence, but when the petro-yuan comes into existence, nations will start to trade in the petro-yuan, and of course the petrodollar will vaporize in the fullness of time. But I mean, I personally am a little bit surprised to see oil get as high as it is, but I think that's also been manipulated by paper markets. There's huge, enormous net long trades that defy explanation. So there is influence in the West to manipulate the price of oil northwards. That will clearly benefit the shale oil industry. There's no doubt. Because if oil goes to $40 a barrel, the shale oil industry is suddenly in serious trouble, just on the basis of, from an economic perspective, of getting a barrel equivalent of oil out of the ground. But I think the oil price will fall at some point. It's probably going to be part of the chain of events as the dollar disappears and the petro-yuan takes ascendancy. But it doesn't mean that the petrodollar will disappear in its entirety. It will be a gradual process. But of course, the killer will be if Saudi Arabia comes out and says we're trading in yuan and no longer the dollar. That could be seen as a major kill shot to not only to the petrodollar but the dollar full stop. So, because despite a lot of people still thinking that, well, de-dollarization is not really happening that quickly, the dollar's usage is dropping. It's not like it's 10%. I mean, there's talk, people have said it's 85, 90%. It's not. It's more like about 60%. And there's a lot of nations moving out of the dollar into the euro, which I think's slightly jumping out of a frying pan into a fire, but that's beside the point. I mean, it's just that's a whole separate matter. But de-dollarization is gathering pace, but the killer will be the petro-yuan and its adoption, and it remains to be seen how quickly that will happen. But if anyone tells you on the March the 26th that the petrodollar's dead, then they're completely wrong. It won't be March the 26th, or even April the 26th, or even May the 26th, barring some incredible change of policy in the Middle East and beyond. But it's a gradual process. But once it's implemented, it's another huge domino effect in the event-driven scenario, and it's very likely, once it's triggered, to see other things trigger in the process. But yeah, I think that's the thing to observe. Wait to see what happens with regards to adoption of the petro-yuan. And then in the process, we'll see how that affects oil prices and also affects the whole petrodollar dynamic.
Very good. Paul, give out your contact information and how people could follow you, your social media, and all that.
Okay, thanks. Well, first off, thanks for all your support in all the time we've been, doing the shows with you. We really appreciate it, and it's been a real pleasure to do it. Well, obviously the website's, well, thank you. The website's thesiriusreport.com. And obviously we've got the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. We've got the Facebook group, which is obviously the Sirius Report. And you very kindly asked people to subscribe to our podcast subscription service, which is $4.75. We've not put the price up in 18 months. We keep it cheap because we want to get people to be able to subscribe. If we could make it a lot more expensive, which would cut out a lot of people who don't have a lot of money. But bear in mind, we put a lot of effort and work into this. It's not just very trivial information. We have to look at things, assess things, analyze things, cross-reference things, and make sure what we provide is accurate information. And that's why the stuff we've covered off on it, the vast majority of it becomes a reality in the fullness of time. And that kind of forecast record is quite rare. So that's why we like people to subscribe, and we feel it's very good value for money. And we won't put the prices up. We'll keep it. We'll keep it cheap because we want to encourage as many people to listen to what we're doing. Yes, okay, there's financial benefits for us in the process. No one's disputing that, but we don't earn a huge amount of money from it. But we're not doing it to become rich. We're doing it because it's important that people are aware, and not just us, but what Rogue Money does and other people out there, to spread the word and an understanding of how the world really operates, and don't get sucked in to all these headline gathering people who sound great, but they don't actually deliver things of substance. They are of no help to anyone. They just cause massive frustration. So,
Exactly.
and also people subscribe to Rogue Money, get more people. If this is the thing we're finding is sometimes someone will post an article that we've put up, and it'll get on an external site somewhere.
Yeah.
And you get masses of people reading the one article, but they don't read anything else. It's like their extension of their interest is the one article. What we need to do is get out there and encourage people. And if you know people, spread the word. Go to, not just to go to Sirius Report, to go to Rogue Money and look at what's being discussed and broaden people's horizons. So they just focus on one article to the detriment of all the other interviews, articles, etc. that have been produced. Because I find that incredible that people have this narrow sort of field of vision where they just look at one thing and go, well, why don't I actually look at some other things they may have done, and forget subscribing to the podcast. Just look at the website. Okay, what have they discussed in the past? Has this become a reality? What's their track record? There seems to be a lack of interest in doing that, and I think unfortunately that happens not just with ourselves, but Rogue Money and other, which is why sometimes there's interviews with people that get a huge amount of following, but then the people don't come back and seem to show interest in other things, and that is sadly a big problem, because it isn't just one article that makes what any of us do. It's the whole broad body of work that we all look to produce and to discuss. So that's something hopefully will change in time, but it is a bit frustrating, because it shows that the people aren't taking a very broad view of what we're doing.
And it's to their detriment. I mean, the whole thing is there's no sensationalism here. There's not, any of this fear porn. It's just raw, beautiful data. And if you're going to get this type of information, you understand the greater, broader play, what's happening geostrategically and geopolitically, you're better able to position yourself and your family. It's you're not going to get this data anyway. There are Fortune 100 companies that have paid tens of thousands of dollars to listen, to hear, to have the kind of stuff that Paul puts out, what I put out, what Jim Willie puts out. Like, these are important forecasts that people need to understand. Very, very, very valuable, folks. There's no, we're not trying to sell you snake oil. We're not trying to, propagate fear or any other headline grabbing, clickbait. There's no clickbait here. It's raw truth. Take it or leave it. But one way or another, you're going to get a geostrategic, geopolitical education here. And that is without a doubt what the Sirius Report and RogueOne.net, we're one of the handful of people that bring it to you.
Yeah, I mean, just a very quick point that I was going to mention, which we didn't going to get around to discussing, but it'll take literally a minute to say, is there's this whole idea that there's this big feud between NATO and Russia. Well, why did the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, who's Peter Pavel, recently state that the NATO alliance has not detected any of these offensive acts of Russia near the borders of the Baltic states? Now, what does the Western media portray? Russia's always invading these nations' airspace. Russia's threatening these nations. and the reality is, a NATO, chairman of the NATO Military Committee comes out and says, no, it's not the case. And he warned against using the term Russian aggression, which we see all the time mentioned in medias and government, because he says there are no hostilities going on. They've seen military presence there, exercises, long-range aviation flights, use of intelligence, but it's not aggression. Far from it. and they've said there's been no violation of Baltic states' territory even.
Right.
And they actually said, that they kind of almost conceded when they said there's no, that so-called violations are caused by technical malfunctions or unintentional human error, and maybe a lack of communication with air traffic control. Now, that's almost a concession. Maybe at times we might have strayed into each other's territory, but it's not intentional. Now, that's the reality. How many headlines do you read about World War III is on the way, Russia's going to invade the West's going to invade Russia? It's not a reality, and we come back to the point we made a few weeks ago. The back channels that go on make sure that we go to bed at night and wake up the following morning, the world's pretty much in the same state. So you can lead the headlines to all the sensationalistic people who try to portray that this and that was going to happen. There has never been any intention for the US and Russia to go to war and have a nuclear war. And apart from the capitalists who may have had designs on that, anyone who works at any level, in any capacity in NATO and in the Russian military and the Russian armed services has no desire to do so. And here's this chairman of the NATO military committee proves the reality. And when you talk about reality, that's the reality. Yeah, it might be boring. It might not be sensationalism, in any way, shape, or form, but it's the raw reality. And it's far better to have the raw reality than the nonsense and sadly, we keep seeing it in the alternative media, where, as you said, it's just clickbait to get people to go and to listen to things. But they're not giving people the reality of what's happening. And there's a smaller but very important example of the reality of what is going on between NATO and Russia.
Right. Absolutely right. Paul, thank you for being on. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Folks, thank you, and likewise.
Oh, it's always a treat, man. It's always a treat. Folks, likewise, subscribe to the Sirius Report, subscribe over here to this channel, like, share, and comment, and hit the notification bell so you are alerted to the next time that Paul comes on, which will be next Monday. With that being said, we're over and out. Take it away. See